Well, one of the most popular movie franchises to ever come out is George Lucas's Star Wars. The first movie came out nearly 50 years ago in 1977, and people have loved these movies ever since, and they've created more movies and TV shows to go along with it. And it's because these stories are all about the little guys, the underdogs, taking on the evil empire and coming out on top. So think about it. In the original Star Wars trilogy, the Galactic Empire had all the power. They had the advanced weapons, massive spaceships, endless resources, armies of stormtroopers. They had the Death Star. And by comparison, the Rebel Alliance, they had almost nothing. And they were just this small collection of pilots, farmers, smugglers, mechanics, and idealists. Yet, if you've seen the movie, you know how it goes. This ragtag group of unlikely heroes, Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia, Han Solo, Chewbacca, C-3PO, and R2-D2, they take on the evil empire. They take on Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine, and they said no to their tyranny and oppression and hatred. And against all odds, they overcome the empire. They save the galaxy. Well, long before the Rebel Alliance stood against the Galactic Empire, there was a Persian queen who did something sort of similar. We just read her story, Queen Vashti. She looked at the demands of a powerful king and an evil empire, and she too said no. And she too refused to bow down to oppression and tyranny and injustice. So her bold and untold story is found in Esther chapter 1. Now, Esther is a really unusual book of the Bible for several reasons. First off, Esther is the only book in the whole Bible that doesn't explicitly mention God by name. It seems as though God is invisible throughout these 10 chapters. But of course, that doesn't mean God isn't present in the story of Esther. On the contrary, God is continually moving behind the scenes and working through brave and faithful people like Esther, like Mordecai, and even Queen Vashti. God's presence is all over the pages of the book of Esther, even if God's name isn't there. Now, the second thing we need to notice about the book of Esther, and you may have picked up on it on the reading today, is that Esther is meant to be political satire. It's written to poke fun at King Ahasuerus and this vast Persian empire. We're meant to read Esther in somewhat of a sarcastic or a snarky and irreverent tone. Esther is essentially saying, like, get a load of these guys. Can you believe these idiots? And in Esther, the Persian Empire, they're the enemies. They're the bad guys. They're not the ones to be celebrated. So when they're doing something, we can assume the right choice is to do the complete opposite. As some have called Esther a divine comedy, because in the end, it's God and God's people who have the last laugh, not the Persians. And third, the book of Esther, it's actually a story about empires. It's what happens when empires come into conflict with God's kingdom. So we might think the story in the book of Esther is all about Esther's bravery and courage as she goes before the king and, fights on behalf of her people, the Jewish people. And that's definitely part of the story. But the book of Esther is ultimately about how we are to live into God's kingdom, even when we physically dwell in lesser earthly empires. See, earthly empires, they're marked by things like greed, pride, opulence, power. And earthly emperors like King Ahasuerus, they believe that they are God. They are the ones that think they are in control and all-powerful. But of course, on the other hand, God's kingdom is the opposite. It's marked by giving up power, by releasing control. It's marked by humility and sacrifice. And God's kingdom is led by a king who gave up his own life to serve and save his people. Of course, I'm talking about King Jesus. And King Jesus shows us that there is a different way to live, a better way to live as we live into God's kingdom, even when we physically dwell within other earthly empires. So the book of Esther, it answers the question, how ought the people of God live in the midst of an evil, seemingly all-powerful empire? Kind of like Star Wars. Well, let's take a look at these two main characters that show up in Esther chapter 1. First, the king, King Ahasuerus. And I'm actually not sure if that's how you pronounce it. We're doing the best we can here. He's sometimes called King Xerxes in other places. But to put it simply, King Ahasuerus, he's the bad guy. He is the villain. He is portrayed as being arrogant and greedy, rich and powerful. But he's also not very smart either, because anytime he needs to make a decision, he has to get all of his counselors and his eunuchs and people, advisors around him, and they kind of sort of manipulate him into making the decision that best benefits them. So in these first few verses of Esther chapter 1, we are supposed to just get a picture of the king's wealth and grandeur. I love how verse 4 says this. He showed off the awesome riches of his kingdom and beautiful treasures as mirrors of how very great he was. And so the chapter goes on and on describing the decorations, the extravagant wall hangings, the purple curtains, the gold and silver couches, the marble mosaic tiled floor, the golden goblets. And it's all very over the top. It's all very opulent, perhaps even somewhat gaudy or tacky. And so King Ahasuerus, he hosted this 6-month feast for his close friends, the nobility, and visiting foreign dignitaries. And then to top it all off, he had a 7-day party for all the men in the city where he lived, the city of Susa. Now, to be blunt, this was a drinking party. As the text tells us, the only rule was no limits on the amount of drink that flowed. They were getting drunk. This is a picture of the kind of excess and wealth and greed and opulence, the waste and gluttony that is often found within empires. And so in the midst of this wild, raucous, drunken party, the drunk king and his drunk buddies, they get a great idea. Let's bring out Queen Vashti, wearing the royal crown to show off her great beauty. Now, the text doesn't say this, but to be clear, the implication is that the queen should come out wearing the royal crown and only the royal crown. Most biblical scholars agree that that was the intention. So this demand, it wasn't about showing off the queen's beauty, it was to embarrass her. It was meant to show the king's power and his control over everything, including his wife. It was meant to objectify the queen as he declared, she's mine, she's my property. Yet, as the story goes, Queen Vashti refused. Now, King Ahasuerus, he was a man who was not used to being told no. And so this led to his great anger and fury. And he was shocked when his wife wouldn't come before him. It's kind of ironic that the most powerful man in the empire was powerless when his wife said no. This king who commanded entire nations from India to Kush, he could not command this one single woman. So this made the king very angry. I suspect it also made him very afraid. He was scared of losing his control and his power, and those around him also feared losing their control too. Well, what about Queen Vashti? Vashti is the first woman named in a book that is about a more well-known woman, and of course, that's Esther. But unfortunately, we don't know much about Queen Vashti. She doesn't say a single word in the book. It's likely that her and the king were in somewhat of an arranged marriage to benefit the empire. And, she did have some small level of power. We're told that she was hosting a party for the women while King Ahasuerus was hosting his big drunken party. But practically speaking, Queen Vashti was beholden to the king for nearly everything. However, Vashti exerts her own limited power when she refuses to appear before the king. She had the bravery and the fearlessness to stand up and say no to this inappropriate request from her superior. Now, we aren't sure why Vashti said no. Maybe she'd acquiesced to the king's drunken request other times before, and she was finally just sick of it. She'd had enough. Maybe she was simply having a good time with her friends at her own party, and she didn't want to leave. Maybe she did it out of modesty. She wanted to protect her body from being ogled and jeered at by these drunken men. But I tend to think that Queen Vashti said no because she was tired of being treated like property. She was tired of being possessed and controlled by the king, and she was over being objectified and dehumanized. She was done being viewed as a piece of meat. There's a poem I found this week as I was researching this sermon. It's by Alice Walker, who's better known for being the author of the book, The Color Purple. And this poem she writes is very short. It's called La Vaca, which is Spanish for the cow. And this is what it says. Look into her eyes and know she does not think of herself as steak. I kind of wonder if that's what Queen Vashti was feeling when she said no, when she refused to appear before the king. Now, unfortunately, we don't know what happens to Queen Vashti after this encounter. The text says that she would just never again appear before the king, ironically getting her request, getting her wish. Now, it's possible that Vashti was simply exiled from the kingdom, that she was stripped of her royal title and her riches, that she was sent away, but it's more likely that she was executed, that she was killed for her defiance, for standing up and saying no. But either way, her refusal paved the way for Esther to rise as the next queen of Persia, and it put her in the position to save the Jewish people from death and destruction. Vashti's courage and risk-taking, they foreshadow Esther's own courage and risk-taking later in the story. And Vashti's no to the king, it paved the way for Esther's yes to God. Now, I think there are a few things we can learn from Vashti's bold and untold story, and the first is the power of saying no. You know, as kids, one of the first words we learn to say is no. And if you've ever been around toddlers or little ones, you know that they have no problem saying no to anything they don't want or anything that they don't like. We usually don't have to teach kids how to say no. They learn how to say no instinctively. But as we grow older, we learn to say no less and less. You know, we don't want to hurt other people's feelings. We don't want to lose out on the relationship or the opportunity. And so over time, we turn into yes men and people pleasers. But there is power in saying no. As you may have heard before, the word no is a complete sentence. No sets a boundary. No removes consent. No says, I am not going to play your games anymore. And no can be one of the holiest words that we speak. There are moments in all of our lives when we need to say no. Moments when we have to choose between greed and sacrifice, between power and humility. Choose between the empires of this world and God's kingdom. We might have to say, no, I'm not going to take advantage of others. No, I'm not sacrificing time with my family to put in more hours at work. No, I'm not going along with your sexual advances. No, I'm not going to cut corners and save money if it puts people at risk. No, I am not going to gossip about that person when they're not even here. No, I am not going to cheat and lie and steal even if everybody else is doing it. So these points are crucible moments in our lives where we have a chance to make an impact through our no. But like Vashti, saying no might cost us something. It might cost us the job, the promotion, the raise, the relationship, the friendship, the opportunity. We have to be willing to lose when we say no. Our choices, even when we are making the right choice, they have consequences. So saying no, it is a big risk, which leads to the second thing we can learn from Vashti's story, which is the power of taking risks. So think of the last time you took a risk. Maybe you put yourself out there for a promotion or a new job. Maybe you took a trip or went on a hike that kind of pushed you out of your comfort zone. Maybe you signed up for a class or a new experience. Maybe you went back to school or switched careers. I'm guessing whatever risk it was that you last took, it was nothing compared to Queen Vashti's risk when she said no, because she risked her life. Now, her story, it reminds me of other faces of our faith. Modern day saints who have also taken risk, who have said no, even at great personal risk or great personal cost to themselves. So I'm reminded of Rachel Den Hollander. She's a lawyer and a former gymnast. She was the first woman to publicly accuse USA team doctor Larry Nassar of sexual abuse. She was the first one to pursue criminal charges against him. And she led the way for over 300 women, including many Olympic medalists, to come forward as survivors of his abuse. It eventually led to his conviction, and he's now serving a life sentence in prison. But her testimony, it could have jeopardized her career, it could have ruined her reputation, but she refused to stay silent. Rachel is a Christian. She talks a lot about her Christian faith, and she continues to advocate for survivors of sexual abuse today. I'm also reminded of another lady, Tarana Burke. You may not know her name, but you might be familiar with the movement she started. She is a business executive who founded the Me Too movement about a decade ago. So Burke empowered other women to speak out against sexual harassment, specifically in the workplace. And she said, no, we're not going to take it anymore. She let women know that they were not alone in their experiences, and even though she too risked ridicule and scrutiny and her reputation, her work has led to more accountability and more gender equity in many workplaces around the world and in our own country. And finally, I'm reminded of Bishop Oscar Romero. He is an El Salvadorian Roman Catholic bishop who in the 1970s stood up against the oppressive regime of his home country. In his outspoken defense of the poor, who were often powerless victims of widespread violence, it brought repeated threats on his life. In his very last sermon, he even pleaded with soldiers and policemen, and he said, "The peasants you are killing are your own brothers and sisters. When you hear a man telling you to kill, remember God's words, 'Thou shalt not kill.' No soldier is obliged to obey a law contrary to the law of God. So in the name of God, in the name of our tormented people, I beseech you, I implore you, I command you to stop the repression." He begged his countrymen to say no to the senseless killing and the violence. The very next day after he preached that sermon, he was assassinated. He was shot while serving communion at a treatment facility for cancer patients. Of course, there's many, many others we could name who have stood up to the empire, who have risked their lives by saying no, and they show us how to also stand up and take those same risks. Well, finally, Vashti's story, it calls us to similarly resist earthly empires as we live instead into God's kingdom. As our baptismal vows affirm, we are to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. So we don't have to play by the empire's rules because we live into a different kingdom. In God's kingdom, it's a kingdom where the first are last and the last are first. In God's kingdom, the powerful are brought low, the mighty are humbled, but the poor and the powerless are lifted up. Now, we often only read Mary's Magnificat, the song of praise she prayed after the angel Gabriel told her she was going to bear God's son. We often only read it around Advent or Christmas, But I love her words because they are a perfect picture of God's kingdom overcoming earthly empires. So hear now Mary's words from Luke chapter 1. The mighty one has done great things for me. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. The kingdom of God often begins when faithful people quietly say no. When we say no, we are not going to take it anymore. Saying no is how empires crumble. Well, as I've done the last 2 weeks in this series, I want to close by sharing the story of another modern day saint. And this one is a little bit closer to home. It comes from one of our own members, John Carver. And he emailed me this story about a bold and brave woman in his life, his grandmother. So here's her story as told by John Carver. Both of my parents worked, so my grandmother was my child care provider from age 4 until age 13. She was also a part-time preacher in a small church. I like her already. She was the most supportive, loving, and kind person in my life, with her hugs and kisses and how she used biblical references every day, and she influenced me the most about love of family and love of God. Her daughter, my Aunt Jeannie, was crippled and never exceeded the 3rd grade, and her only way to walk was by using crutches. My grandmother taught me all about handicapped and disabled persons and how to treat them well. Now, there are many illustrations of her love, but I will mention the most meaningful one. A friend and I were throwing a baseball over a neighbor's house, and one of us threw it too hard and broke a window. The elderly woman who owned the home called the police on us. So someone from the neighborhood ran to my grandmother's house and told them that the police were taking away her grandson. I saw her running up the street, and she began giving those policemen a piece of her mind for even thinking about taking me downtown to the police station. This was in Kansas City. Her ferocity scared them out of even thinking about doing harm to her grandson. I should mention that she was maybe 4'10". If she was soaking wet, she weighed 90 pounds, but she is forever in my heart for her love and setting me on the right track and knowing that there is a God. Grandma Carver was a fierce, bold, brave, and strong woman in the spirit of Queen Vashti. She said no to policemen taking away her grandson and causing him harm for making a simple mistake. May we all have her same ferocity and courage today. We're going to close by singing Mary's Magnificat, one of my favorite songs. It's the Canticle of the Turning. I've talked about it before. You can stay seated and the words will be on screen. Sorry, go ahead.